Hello, students. Welcome to the next lecture. And we talked about laissez faire perspective, we talked about mercantilist perspective, and today we are going to talk about structuralist perspective. What is structuralist perspective? You probably would have heard of this guy named Karl Marx, right? Hardly anyone wouldn't have heard of him. Karl Marx is a great philosopher, but many wouldn't support his ideas. So, Karl Marx is a philosopher born in Germany and moved to England, and he did research in the London Library and wrote his ideas. And this was during the Industrial Revolution in England. Industrial Revolution is when industries were created, and and large amount of fossil fuels were used and changed the world. Okay, now it's spread around the world. So Karl Marx is watching the life standards of the poor and the working class in these industries, and how their lives are getting miserable every day despite working hard for wages. Whereas the capitalist, he saw, the industrialist, who are the owners of the factories, getting richer and richer. So his ideas came from his perspective. And why are we studying this guy's ideas in international, and especially talk about inequality? Well, it's very relevant even now, his ideas. Remember, each perspective you study is a way to see the world. So when we saw laissez-faire, that's one way to see the world. It's like a lens, glasses you wear, and when you wear mercantilist lens, you see the world, how it functions. And this is another theory, perspective of how the structuralist way of seeing the world. So that's why we want to understand Karl Marx. And many scholars build their theory on Karl Marx foundation. So what's some basic idea of Karl Marx? So he said proletariat. I'm writing it here so I could show it to you, as we don't have a blackboard. Proletariat, okay, are the working class, the poor, and the bourgeoisie. And you probably would have heard of this word because some people say bougie, right? And so bourgeoisie and proletariat. The bourgeoisie exploits the proletariat, working class, and the bourgeoisie gets richer and richer by exploiting the poor, because in modern times, whoever invests capital makes the profit. The labor gets just the wages. If you're working in a place, you get a salary or wages. You don't get to have a share in the profit, except some rare companies where they do share profits with employees. That's a different story. But bourgeoisies get richer and richer enormously for Karl Marx on the backs of the proletariat. Okay, and you might think in capitalist system the profit belongs to the one who risks and invests his capital, but why not the other way? What, for Karl Marx, the idea of capitalist getting rich because of the labor of the working class. So they are getting their profit based on the work of the labor class, right? You have to see it from different perspective. So there used to be feudalism. You heard of it? Feudalism, where like feudal overlords will see a lot of people in the society. Most of them were working as labor, and that was changed into capitalist. You probably heard of like how Black Plague came and wiped out 1/3 of the European population. Yeah, the epidemic, Black Plague, and it collapsed the feudalistic system because there's not much people out there living to provide labor. So it, feudalism moved on to capitalism, capitalism to socialism, Marx's theory of history. Now, we're going to talk about how the Karl Marx idea was taken over by modern means relatively modern because Karl Marx is 19th century, and in the 20th century this guy named Lenin, you probably heard of him, right? uh, Created this idea of Karl Marx into a political power in a state. And where did that happen? That happened in Soviet Union. Well, Soviet Unions were ruled by czars, right? Czars. Russia was ruled by czars, and Lenin was a very scholarly and revolutionary. He went and overthrew the Tsar regime and took power. And usually, books sometimes call it as a revolution, but it's a coup d'etat. What's the difference? A revolution is when people demand change and overthrow the regime and government. Okay, whereas coup d'etat is just the elite people in power overthrow the government and the regime. What is the regime? Regime is like the software in your computer. State is the hardware of your computer. Okay, and the person who operates the computer is the government. Government come and go. Regimes doesn't change often, and state rarely changes. Okay, now you understand there's three levels. People interchangeably use them, but they're not. So regime change happened, and it created a communistic change of regime. And for him, the the capitalism has its own seeds of decay, right? Karl Marx saw it that way as well. And for Lenin, he saw the West as an imperialistic ambitions of going and conquering other parts of the world. Remember, this revolution happened in 1917, early 20th century, and many of the Western European countries were occupying global South. India didn't get freedom until 1947. Most of African countries, not most of all of the ones, the sub-Saharan African countries got freedom after India's freedom. So they were all occupied by colonized. And so what is the idea? It is three types of imperialism. So Lenin wrote a book called Imperialism. Okay. The imperialism has three types: military imperialism, economic imperialism, cultural imperialism. So let's talk about military imperialism. Military imperialism is this old way of going and occupying a country. For example, what the Great Britain did to India for hundreds of years, they occupied us and took resources from India. For example, when they came to India, India was 25% of the global economy. That's correct. It was a very rich country. Entire Europe, England alone is not equal to India's economy. Entire Europe put together will come close to 25% of the global economy. So India alone was such a wealthy country. But the time the British left us, it was 2 to 3% of the global economy. They swindled, exploited. Are you following? And military imperialism. They came there as corporations, East India Corporation, and took over India. To give you a modern analogy, it's like Apple in California, the company, is taking over entire California and little by little taking over all the 50 states of the America, and they rule. What do you think about that? And that's what they did. Through economic reasons, they came for trading, and then military they used to take over India. And many times, even in African countries, colonization was exploitation, pure exploitation. So that's military imperialism. Economic imperialism, on the other hand, is modern. It's more in the recent times, which I'll talk in detail in this lecture. But it's about using economic tools to project your power on another country to enrich yourself and exploit. Okay. Cultural imperialism is projecting your culture as the best way of life to others. Hollywood does that. American fast food companies, multinational corporations, all this go and tell, because even now in South Asia and other countries, obesity is increasing. One of the reasons is because of the fast food companies, from KFC to McDonald's and others, going and building companies there. And people are losing their way of food and adapting to this. It's the cool way, the American way of eating fast food. It's expensive too in these countries. It's not like cheap like here, McDonald's, KFC, and it's unhealthy food. But for people in cities, it's a cool way. And so that's a cultural imperialism. That's one example, but there are many, many examples of cultural imperialism. What is the right way of living and projecting your power? Excuse me, let me have some more water. Thank you. So now you understand that when Karl Marx talked about class system, that there's different classes, proletariat and bourgeoisie, and how one exploits the others. And similarly, states, in international arena, states, the rich ones exploit the poor ones. And how do they do that? They also take raw materials from these poor states, right? Immanuel Wallerstein talked about this theory called dependence, modern world system theory. Okay, in that he talked about countries which are sending raw materials to the developed nations, and these developed nations produce products using the raw materials and sell them back to these third world countries, poor countries or developing countries, and exploit them, because they have to buy only their products. Like in India, the British took cotton from India, manufactured cotton clothes, and sold it in India in expensive prices. And so this is, I will draw a diagram of the Immanuel Wallerstein. This is called ferry. I'll show you. Ferry, and then core, semi-periphery, their countries. So core, the countries which are core are the ones which are well developed, rich. Periphery, countries in periphery system of the international political economy, and these core countries exploit the peripheral countries for raw materials. So these countries are dependent on them for products manufactured there and bring it back to sell. Semi-periphery is countries which are in developing state but still are in a dependency, like Chile for modern example. Periphery is many of the sub-Saharan African countries are still in periphery. Core countries are like UK, US, France, all these Western countries. Okay, so this design of this world economic order is created to enrich, just like the capitalist Karl Marx talked about. It was using the labor to enrich. These poor countries were used as a means to an end for enriching the rich countries. And if you look at it, there's a neo-imperialism, neo-imperialism, a word which means like the old imperialism is like what putting military and doing it, colonizing. And now with the UN and modern world, UN was created after World War II, in case you didn't know, United Nations, and for the world's peace and security is its goal. And so in modern world, there's a neo-imperialism. That means a new form of imperialism. And what did they do? Well, even if you look at Vietnam War, many people say, oh, Vietnam War happened because to contain communism. That is the realist school of view. Who's the realist? Remember, a realist is a school which views the world as it is. They are known for power politics, understanding power politics. It's the dominant theory in international relations, realism, or it's called realpolitik. So realism is gives the reason for states' actions. States act whatever it takes to increase their power for its self-interest. Its self-interest is the key for states to behave. So, for realist perspective, America went into Vietnam in order to contain communism, contain to stop the flow of communism in the entire Southeast Asia. However, if you look at it from the perspective of neo-imperialism or political economic point of view, it is American hegemony to because the British hegemony was breaking down. British hegemony, remember, British was the superpower in the world for a long time. And you might think, really, yeah. Before that, there were other powers, Ottoman. The powers come and go. There's a wonderful book by Paul Kennedy. It's called "The Rise and Fall of Great Powers," and like how many countries come to become this dominant power, hegemon. They call it Hegemon. Look it up, and they stay there, and then they fall. So Paul Kennedy at the Yale University wrote about why some countries come and become powerful and then they collapse. So the Britain was losing his hegemonic status and was a breakdown. It's like an international police, and if they break down, international order is changing. So the United States stepped in and went into Vietnam because its national interest of oil, all the resources from Indochina needs to be made sure that America gets its supply. And if you look at Eisenhower was the president, right? And the Greek Vietnam War is considered as the um, five-stage Greek tragedy because one by one each president, little by little, went into the quagmire and stepped in little by little. And by Nixon time, it was way too much blood and treasure was spent, and we didn't achieve anything. But Eisenhower was the president after Truman warned. It was Truman which started the tragedy, and Eisenhower, and then Kennedy, and then Lyndon Johnson, who escalated the war, and then Nixon also. Okay, five-stage Greek tragedy. So now, five president. But Eisenhower warned that his last speech from the Oval Office is called military industrial complex. What is that military industrial complex? He's talking about the companies which benefit from American companies which benefit from the war because they could sell weapons to American government. And who pays for it? American taxpayers. They get rich. These companies get rich. And so do you understand it's a new form of neo-imperialism to get rich? You're making a country fight wars. And so what are the companies you're talking about which makes weaponry for America? Like right now, do you know? Like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, right? And many other companies who make weaponry for America, American government, and it's billions of dollars. The national security budget every year is approximately $1 trillion. American national security budget, 1 trillion. Can you imagine? In those numbers we don't deal with, 1,000 billion makes a trillion. That's correct. So $1 trillion we are spending, and so goes to military contractors who are making the weapon, and even soldiers like Blackwater, you heard of it, companies which supply paramilitary forces. So Eisenhower warned during his farewell address from the Eisenhower, President Eisenhower warned about the military industrial complex. that he's saying that the military uh, suppliers exaggerate the strength of the enemy so they could justify military spending. Are you following? Because it's for economic incentives, and it's not like realists say it's state power for the benefit of the state, but it is for the in this way of seeing it, neo imperialistic way of seeing things shows that it's for the benefit of few large corporations. It's economic interest. Okay, you might think, okay, well, it happened at the time, but not. It continues. Even if you look at Ronald Reagan assisted Saddam Hussein. Remember, Saddam Hussein was overthrown in 21st century by Bush Jr. We went in and overthrew. The same Saddam Hussein was assisted militarily by Ronald Reagan's administration to fight against Iran, because at the time Iran was America's enemy, which had a hostage crisis for 444 days. They held American diplomats as hostages from American embassy in Iran, and so we fought. We didn't directly. We supported Saddam Hussein, supplying weapons and material so that he could fight a long war, almost 80-year war with Iran. And even after the fall of the Soviet Union, 1991, it's called the new age of imperialism. Why? After the fall of Soviet Union, 1991, Soviet Union collapsed. Cold War ended. So up till Cold War, there's a bipolar moment. Bipolar means two countries strongly projecting power. They are the two superpowers. So there was an order in the world, the balance. There were many countries which joined with the Soviet Union. There are other countries in the West joined with the United States. Now Soviet Union collapsed. And so collapse of Soviet Union created a quote unquote new age of imperialism. This new age of imperialism was using economic imperialism. You don't directly use military like good old days to go and occupy, but use modern means to project power and control and conquer other countries and subjugate. And those are economic imperialism tools using institutions like IMF, International Monetary Fund. If you go to DC, we have it there. World Bank. World Bank is there to give loans to poor countries, right? To alleviate poverty. IMF's job is to give loans to poor countries. And WTO, World Trade Organization, which is to resolve trade problems between countries. All these are Western institutions created after World War II. And these institutions use money as a source to coerce these third world countries which need money. So if you're a third world country, you're coming to me asking for a loan, and I am IMF. What do I say? Sign here in this document. I will give you a loan, but sign here in this document. What does the document say? The document says that you will privatize many of your governmental agencies and you will deregulate. And why do we do that? It's a neoliberalism, this economic model of freedom of markets will provide better quality, not in the interest of their country, but the interest of American companies. Because if you say, if you're playing role play, I am the American making you sign, you're coming from the third world country or a poor country. When you sign it, you have to open your markets for American companies to come and compete with your companies. Remember, when your companies are small and tiny, it cannot fight a fair fight against Americans' large companies. So your companies will be defeated and destroyed, and your economies will be dependent on American companies. This is going back to what, like the British taking cotton and making shirts and bringing it to India to sell, will be dependent. It's like the dependence theory. modern scholars who built it on Karl Marx, right? Immanuel Wallerstein's idea of the core and periphery countries. Yes. So this economic institutions use these institutions as a means to achieve an end of projecting power and dominating other countries. Even in the 1990s, President Bill Clinton promoted economic liberalism with selective military intervention. So they were not using military as the main source of like military imperialism, but economics was used as the main source. But when Bush came into office, Bush Jr., not Bush Sr., Bush Sr. was president before Bill Clinton, right? Right before. Bush Jr., right after Bill Clinton, was had many advisors who were neocons, 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 which means neoconservatives. These guys were Woodrow Wilson on steroids. My professor used to say. What does that mean? Woodrow Wilson had this idea of making the world safe for democracy. That means we if the world has more democracies, then it is easy to maintain peace. This is an idea from Immanuel Kant, philosopher who lived before American founding fathers, and he wrote a book called Perpetual Peace. The world, more countries have democracies, so and the world countries becoming more democratic helps peace in the world. Why? Because if you're democratic, I'm democratic, we will make peace. We have same common ideas. Whereas if you are an authoritarian country and I'm a democratic, we will tend to go to war. Look at the countries America has fought. Look at it. We're not going to go to war to Canada. We're not going to go to war with England, are we? No. But we might go to war with China because it's an authoritarian country, or Russia because it's another authoritarian country. Yeah, it has a sham, illiberal democracy. It looks like a democracy. Putin got elected, but it's not real democracy. And the wars we fought in the past, even World War II, if you take Hitler's Nazi regime, it's not a democracy. And Japan, all this, Kant has some idea. So Woodrow Wilson said that we want to make the world safe for democracy. Now, what is the neocons? Neocons are Woodrow Wilson on steroids, right? These guys want to overthrow governments in countries around the world so that democracy could be created. So they just go a step ahead and use force to overthrow non-democratic regimes so that democracy could be created in these countries. Like we went into Iraq because to overthrow Saddam Hussein during Bush Jr. era and overthrew Saddam Hussein to create democracy, but democracy didn't flourish in Iraq like a Jeffersonian idea of democracy. It's hard in some societies and culture. There's various factors playing, but we're not going to go in there. But to understand that to create the world like that, even when the Bush administration went in there, their idea was, oh, we could, whatever war money we spent on this war could be made through oil. Yeah, they didn't make much money in oil because the money spent in the war. Are you ready? A book was written by Linda Burns and Joseph Stiglitz is an economist. $3 trillion war. The Iraq war cost America $3 trillion. For those who don't know trillion, again, 1,000 billion. 1,000 million makes a billion, and 1,000 billion makes a trillion. 3 trillion. Can you imagine the things you could do good with here in the country instead of spending, wasting it away? And who benefits? The war companies. Like a war is a racket. The companies which supply weapons and others for the American government benefits from it. So it's a new imperialism. Now, Obama came into office, so very progressive, ideal man, and so he would at least reduce this form of neo-imperialism, but actually didn't change much, really. Many scholars write like he in fact used more military drones Yes, he didn't want to put soldiers on the ground because it costs American lives, but Obama increased military drones to kill um, enemies of the state, like terrorists in Pakistan and Afghanistan border. Thousands of collateral damage happens. Collateral damage means you intend to kill a terrorist, but a civilian dies during that operation. And children, even children, died. So there were a lot of protest around the world. He used that to kill extrajudicial assassinations. Even a citizen in Yemen was killed, American citizen. You know, by constitution, you have to be arrested. You have to have your judicial process. You are not guilty until proven. Mm, because he was making YouTube videos promoting terrorism, he was killed by a drone, targeted, along with his friends who scrambled to get into their SUV and drive away from the desert when they saw the drone coming. There's a good book called President and the Terrorists if you want to read the whole story about this Yemeni who was an American citizen who was killed there. So the point is that there is truth to see it from this the structuralist perspective of, the structures of hierarchy that the bourgeoisie tries to enrich, and the account of proletariat, Karl Marx idea, the modern way of seeing that states try to enrich themselves in the account of the poor countries, and inside the developed states there's the rich companies try to enrich on the account of others. What is the problem with that? One is inequality. It creates inequality in the society. I mean, inequality is a big problem. Why so, you might ask? Well, some scholars say inequality. Joseph Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, is a professor at Columbia. He wrote a book on the price of inequality. Inequality creates instability in societies. America is increasingly unequal society. The top three guys have more money than the bottom 50% of Americans. Bottom 50%, that's more than 150 million Americans have less money put together compared to the three people in the top put together. Isn't that crazy? But that is the capitalistic system. And these were, according to Karl Marx, capitalism has its own seeds of decay. That because his idea was the proletariat will overthrow the bourgeoisie, a revolution will happen, and because this system is unsustainable. And as inequality increases, modern scholars talk about creating instability, which means people will become restless. They are having lesser and lesser money, pushing middle class into poverty. For example, 1980s, the minimum wage compared to 2023, it might seem like absolute numbers, it's large, but adjusted for inflation, 1980s money is more, minimum wage is more than now, according to scholars. Like Elizabeth Warren wrote about it in her book. So inequality is a problem. It reduces happiness in society. It increases depression. It increases mental health problems. And trust in society erodes with inequality. And all these problems inequality creates. And inequality is measured in Gini coefficient index. I don't know whether I ever mentioned it to you or not, but even otherwise, I'll tell you 0 to 1. You could see it. 0 means everybody in the country is equal. I mean, there is no country, technically, everybody is equal. Even in communistic countries, the guys in the top has everything, right? And the people at the bottom don't. And 1 means one person have everything in the country, but others don't have nothing. There is no country like that either. So countries in between, America is increasing in this way, and about 0.48, don't quote me on this, but approximately 0.48. And the most unequal country is South Africa. Well, why? Because blacks' apartheid regime kept them for a long time not educated and in poverty. To get out of it, even after Mandela got elected and others, it takes time because property is owned for a long time by the white, um, the Afrikaners, they're called. So you understand that inequality is a problem for developing countries, and Karl Marx idea is there. Even now, if you look at candidates who are running for office, both the right and the left, like Trump or even Bernie Sanders, who ran against Biden, he talks about inequality. Bernie always says the millionaires and the billionaires are the problem, and they're getting richer and richer. He has a point, and they are getting richer and richer. Whether you agree with the way he wants to deal with it, it is a fact. And so Karl Marx's idea of and then the further scholars like Immanuel Wallerstein. I didn't write the name. Did I spell that for you? Let me make sure I spell it correctly. Immanuel, you know how to spell Immanuel, okay? And Wallerstein, yeah, Wallerstein, Wallerstein. Immanuel Wallerstein. All these modern scholars talks about the problem of neo imperialism, of keeping countries in the periphery and exploiting them. Anyway, I will end the lecture here on structuralist perspective, and we will be talking about the next class on constructivism. And constructivism is another way of seeing the world. And then after that, we move on to learn about different aspects of the global economy. And see you. Take care. Bye.